Our keynote speaker is Ira Winkler. He's a well-recognized security professional, industry leader, and he's author of You Can Stop Stupid and Security Awareness for Dummies. Originally, when we were like, hey, let's do B-Sides, let's do this here in Fort Wayne, he reached out to me on LinkedIn and was like, hey, do you need a speaker? And I'm like, yeah, that would be amazing. And so we talked, and I got to hear about it a little more, and we just were able to work it out. So Ira, thank you so much for coming and just joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Is the mic on? Yeah, mic's on. Okay. Is this being recorded? Yes. Damn it. Okay. Okay, let me then. Does anybody in the audience mind if I curse? No. Okay. Okay, so let me talk. So I have stories to like my presentations, because really what happens is, if you know me, I just kind of like something gets in my head. Sorry, I was just about to say something gets up my ass and I can't let it go. And like I just have these things that trigger me. And so one time I was speaking at a conference, and it was like I was this speaker right after lunch, and I was on the lunch buffet line with a bunch of people like you, no offense. And then there I was, and the guy in front, they had a table that was giving out stickers that said, "Don't click on shit." And so this guy in front of me, he's like, "Oh, I need a whole bunch of these stickers. I've got a whole bunch of users that keep clicking on shit." And I'm like, "Wow, you must give your users a lot of shit to click on." And he's like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "Well, how can these people click on all this shit if they're not going to, if you're not giving it to them? Are they like bringing in their own email just to bother you at work?" He's like, "No." I go, "So they're looking at your email on your systems, and then they click on it, and you're blaming them." And he's like, "What do you mean?" I go, "And by the way, if you know they're going to keep opening all that stuff you keep giving them, why don't you do anything about the fact they're going to open it after the fact?" He's like, "What do you mean?" Anyway, he knew what I meant, but you know what I mean. But anyway, that's what got up my butt, and that's why I'm giving this presentation. So here's the thing. I don't know about you, but I keep hearing about how many people hear the expression, the human firewall, and the user's your last line of defense. And you hear it all the time, and that's the solution. This is the most stupidest statement I've ever heard in the history of cybersecurity, creating the human firewall and your user's the last line of defense. Your user is never the last line of defense. I mean, think about ransomware. Is there a user that is somehow taking out some device that manually flips every bit on a hard drive to install ransomware? No, the computer installs the ransomware. Does the user have something to do with it? Yeah, the user has something to do with it, but it's not the user who's actually encrypting everything. In order for a user to fail, your whole system essentially has to fail. And when you start putting it, well, we just need, because the people who tout the human firewall say, you can't blame the user, it's not the user's fault. Yet the solution is to make sure the user's more aware. So basically you're saying it's not the user's fault, but the reason it'll happen is because they weren't aware enough. And they don't realize the stupidity of that statement. So anyway, that's how this presentation came to be. And this is just kind of me trying to wake myself up. So if you can't figure that out. So anyway, oh yeah, I'm using the typical Walmart presentation. This is in the typical, that's me. Anyway, God, I really hate that. They gave me a presentation that had nice pictures and all that stuff, but Walmart wants to make sure we don't abuse people's logos. So now we just have a blue Twitter. Just imagine there's a bird there. Anyway, so what happened? How many people remember the Twitter hack that happened like in ancient history 2 years ago? Like it's hardly notable anymore. But what happened during that attack was all of a sudden everybody woke up and Joe Biden's account, Obama's account, and it had nothing to do with politics, just any account that had 100 million followers or whatever it was, all of a sudden tweeted out saying, "You won something, send your information here and send us Bitcoin and you will get your tax refund," or whatever it was. So anyway, obviously that was a fraud. Somebody hacked into all of Twitter's account, and Twitter took immediate action. They had some engineer ironically not go to Twitter, but go to post blog posts. And then they went ahead and posted these blogs, and it's like, we're really looking into it, but it appears to be a super sophisticated social engineering attack, and they were using vishing. That's how sophisticated it was. So anyway, then they started doing it, and they kept posting these updates of what happened, why it happened, and so on. And then, it comes to find out 4 days later, they caught the culprit, who was a 17-year-old criminal mastermind, the way they were painting that. Now, 17-year-old criminal mastermind should not necessarily go together, because if your 17-year-old is going to knock out your security of Twitter, you're not really that awesome at that point in time. It's not the fact he was a mastermind. It's the fact that they just couldn't stop a 17-year-old, literally the hacker in his basement, from doing something. And that was the problem. What really happened in that attack? Yes, there was a lot of social engineering attack. Yes, to a certain extent, they were taking advantage of people working from home during the pandemic. And like Twitter had their engineers working at home. I think they all worked at home anyway, but that was a separate issue. But they still love to blame the pandemic. And then the person figured out that there was multi-factor authentication, found names of people who worked in Twitter, and tried to log in as them, got their user IDs and passwords. Then there was a multi-factor authentication code that was sent to them. And he sent them a phishing page that said, okay, please log into this page and give us your code. And then they would take the code and then log in as that person, compromising multi-factor authentication, which is a little, give the 17-year-old, who I will not refer to as a mastermind, a little bit of credit for putting some effort into it. But then they went ahead and got access to all of Twitter. And then it turns out, then they're like, well, we're doing this, we're improving our awareness. I'm like, how is improving awareness going to have much to do with this? Because the underlying problem at the same time was more than 1,000 people had the opportunity to change major accounts. 20% of Twitter had access to admin tools that was essentially on a SharePoint or similar site inside the organization, which is kind of on the outrageous side. And is the thing, let me go back a second. But then the problem is, most people don't remember this, but back in 2018, Twitter had a contractor in Germany who basically quit, and on his way out said, screw it, I'm going to do what I think everybody should have done a couple years ago, and he deleted Donald Trump's account at the time. So what happened was Twitter's like, oh, we got to stop that from happening again. So instead of implementing better security policies across the board, they just said, okay, to delete Donald Trump's account, you need 2 people to do that. And as opposed to thinking, what about all the rest of the accounts that might be hacked? But anyway, that was the 17-year-old criminal mastermind. How many people remember when Cloudflare went down just about the same time as Twitter? This was ironically different. Ironically, the CEO started posting about what was going on and what Cloudflare was doing, and he did it ironically to Twitter, which really cracked me up that Twitter didn't do it to Twitter, but this guy did. So anyway, the CEO of Cloudflare went on, and what happened was, for those of you that don't know what Cloudflare does, it's a content delivery network, CDN, and basically it provides the point of presence for major websites all around the world. So if their site goes down, pretty much Twitter goes down. Well, I don't know if Twitter's a customer, but just imagine major sites all around the world don't have access, you don't have access to them because the network that actually facilitates it is gone. So what happened was Cloudflare went down, and they kept investigating. The CEO came on, a couple times. Then one time he comes on and he says, we figured out what the problem was. An engineer made a modification to the routing table that was inaccurate, and that caused our network to go down. And somebody replied back on Twitter, because of course this all happened on Twitter, and said, I would hate to be that engineer. And what happened was the CEO replied back and said, it's not the failure of a single engineer. It's a failure of leadership, because one person making one error should not take down our entire network. And that was the right way to approach the problem. Unfortunately, that's not the way most people do, but there was so much to learn from there. And when I do, cybersecurity, I really like to learn from other places, because in cybersecurity, let's face it, we act like we are the first profession in history that ever had to deal with a concept called human error or malicious people or whatever. But for some reason, cybersecurity thinks we are the first to ever deal with human error, and I'm sorry to tell you, we're not. So one profession that's been dealing with it for a while is safety science. Now, for up until recently, safety science had this attitude where, like their job is inside large companies to figure out why people might get killed, how they injure themselves. And they do this not because they're altruistic and think we want for the health of the company and our employees. They do so, frankly, because insurance requirements, there's major cost to a shutdown. So for example, if an automobile manufacturer, if there's an injury on a factory floor, they might have to shut down the whole factory floor to figure out what's going on. And so there's a lot of money. There's hard costs. And that's something cybersecurity could also learn from them, because these people actually know how much it costs when a network goes down, as an example. They know how much an outage costs. They track it. Their insurance rates go up based upon the number of injuries and everything like that. And what they used to do was, when there was an accident, they used to say, okay, why was this person stupid enough to get themselves killed? And then how can we stop that as another stupid person from getting themselves killed? And that's how they previously approached the concept of people harming themselves and so on. But then to me, that's kind of like in cybersecurity, we use the analogy of, I hope you all know the analogy of a canary in a coal mine. For those of you that don't, because I realize, okay, I'm kind of getting comparatively old to a lot of people. But the problem is that most, they used to have, like in coal mines, they would put a canary inside with all the workers because canaries die when there's less poisonous gas than a person would die at. So that meant that if the canary dropped dead, get out. So they went ahead, and that's the analogy. But in cybersecurity, we think, oh, what we should do is just make healthier canaries. Let's put a gas mask on the canary, and that will solve all the problems. The problem isn't the canary dying. Well, you don't want a canary dying of old age or something like that, let's face it. But you also don't want to cover up the underlying problem, that the mine itself is unsafe, that there's poisonous gas in the mine, and eventually it might get poisonous enough that the actual human beings will die. So that's the problem. We basically try to put, with awareness training, the human firewall, we're essentially putting gas masks on our people to cover up the stink of what we're giving them. So, let's talk about how safety science relates to operational issues. So for example, there's the concept in safety science of proximity. So when a user clicks on the network, why do we blame the user? Or sorry, the user clicks on a phishing message. Sorry, it's still early in the morning. I haven't got much sleep this week, so it's adding up. But anyway, when a user clicks on a phishing message, that we blame the user because the user clicked on it, and that's where everything happened. If somebody kills themselves on a factory floor, we blame that person because that's where it happened. If somebody slips and falls on something, we blame where that person slipped and fell. They don't stop to think, for example, and this actually happened to my wife, and I can't mention it, but it was in a Walmart store, where she slipped inside a non-Walmart competitor. And what happened was, she looked, and why did that happen? She didn't slip because she slipped. She slipped because there was a refrigeration unit that just kept leaking water. And she turned the corner, and she just slipped on the water that was on the floor, not seeing it. And why did she slip? Did she slip because she had no balance? No, she slipped because there was water that was coming out that she had no idea where it was, that was there because of a long-standing issue. That's kind of the same thing when we look at operational problems, safety science, and everything else. When a user clicks on a phishing message, the problem is not the user clicking there. The problem is the whole string of events that led to the user having the phishing message in their inbox in the first place, in my opinion. But anyway, that's kind of what they do. In breakdowns, like for example, if a bus driver drives a bus and it gets a flat tire, do you blame the bus driver? Unless the bus driver was speeding down a road and hit a curb at 50 miles an hour, it's likely not the bus driver's fault. At the same time, but the bus driver was in control. Like, yeah, but it wasn't his fault. Same thing with medical postmortems. Like if you've ever experienced like a medical environment, what happens is they sit down on a regular basis, for example, in hospitals, and they try to review why people died, or had serious incidents inside the hospital over the course of a month. And they sit there and then like other doctors drill them and ask them all these questions. And they figure out, okay, why during the surgery did you make this cut which led to the death? And then they find out, it's like after doing it, and safety science professionals stepped in, they said, okay, that cut at that time was the perfect thing to do. Okay, why was that the perfect thing to do? Then they back up a decision. Then they're like, well, that decision was right. Then they backed up another decision. Then what they did was when they figured out why people were dying in general, not just for any specific cause, they found that the actual act itself was usually right almost 100% of the time. What happened was there was a decision, likely 100 decisions ago, that caused that person to lead to that inevitable act. And then the question was, how can they make a better decision 100 decisions for? Where were the key places? So the proximity even of where a surgeon took an action was not actually the cause of the incident. So anyway, new school safety science going with that approach basically says, if there is an incident, yes, the proximity is there, but the person the person causing the harm or being harmed is just a symptom of a problem with the entire system. That somewhere along the line, it led to this type of thing happening. And the job of a good safety professional is to figure out that chain of events. And how do you stop the chain of events from leading to that incident happening in that proximity or more damage occurring after the fact of the incident happening? Now, when you start to look at this in cybersecurity words, yes, the user is as much a part of the system as the computers, as the networking, as everything else. And when a user takes an action, it's not a failure of the user, it's a failure of the entire system. I was quoted once for saying that if a user can click on a message and ruin your network sucks. And that's kind of how you have to approach this whole problem. It's the network, it's everything else, because the one thing I can guarantee you, I once had a nice exchange with a vendor, and I'm sarcastic in that, where they were saying, we can totally remove human error from cybersecurity. I'm like, what are you smoking? And they were sitting there like, no, we can do this. I'm like, in the history of mankind, there has never been the removal of human error, and there never will be. But what you have to do is you have to look at it. You can't just say, we will make the perfect user, when a user can't even overcome a lot of these issues at the same time. But also you have to consider what happens if a user's malicious. Statistically, well, actually, that's on another slide, so I'll get to it. But the user error is really just a symptom of what's wrong with the whole system. Anybody here a scuba diver? Okay, a couple of you. So I'm a master scuba diver trainer. I just got bored one time and I kept going for it. And what happened was you just keep taking classes. Frankly, I live in Maryland, and even around here in Indiana, if you really don't go to classes, there's no good reason to go scuba diving. The water sucks, it's cold and everything. Somebody will say, well, we have this wonderful site somewhere down south. I'm like, I don't care. It still kind of sucks. It's not the Caribbean. So anyway, I took this picture because the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't stop stupid, CAM''T, was when I was taking my scuba instructor training, and the course director was basically going around, you can't stop stupid. Somebody's just going to do something, and they're just going to do it because they feel like doing it. They're bored. They have, ADD, whatever it is, underwater, and you just can't stop that. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? This whole course is about stopping stupid. Because for those of you who are divers, you can confirm this. Before you get in the water, at least lately, the new methods, you have to sign up for a class online. You take pretty much, I don't know what, like dozens or 100+ hours of online courses. You then take a test, and the course is basically, here's all the ways you could die, and here's all the ways you shouldn't be dying if you pay attention. And so that's what the course is. Then what happens is you take your test results to a dive shop. The dive shop basically looks at the results. If they have half a brain, they make you take the quiz because there's been a lot of people who know how to cheat. And they basically want to make sure that sitting in their facilities, the person actually didn't cheat and can still pass the test. So anyway, then once you do that, then they'll say, okay, great, now show up to a pool session. You get in the pool. Before you do that, you show everybody how to check their equipment and set it up properly. Then you have them do it. Then you have their buddies check the equipment. Then you check it because you know you can't trust any of them. And then everybody gets in the shallow water, and then you make sure, oh, even before that, actually, we put them in a pool and make people swim. I think it's 200 yards, maybe it's like 200 to 400 yards, and then also float in the pool for about 10 minutes. And do you think we really care that the people can float in the water? I mean, that's the purpose of scuba equipment. You don't care. You know, you don't have to know how to swim. But the only reason we do that is to make sure they're not going to freak out in the water. So anyway, they don't freak out. You put them on the equipment, put them in the shallow end, take them down to the deeper end, and then finally you have them do skills. Then after a while you say, okay, you can do the skills in a pool. Let's take you to open water in an environment like this where there's dive platforms at places where they take students. Usually this is, you know, it's about 15 to 20 feet on average. It's not allowed to be below 30 feet because it's really, really hard to kill yourself in less than 30 feet of water. Can happen, but still really, really hard. And then we're insured, the facility's insured, the dive boat's insured. We take out insurance on the students that they don't know about just because we know where the hospitals are, CPR, AEDs, all that sort of stuff, oxygen. So we know what's going to happen. Everybody's prepared. And then you have an environment like this, and let's see. Oh, this works really, really well. So anyway, what's probably happening here is this is a student who's being tested on what's known as a fin pivot, where they basically are trying to pivot up and down on their fins. Here's the instructor watching them, but then you can see there's a whole bunch of people. That person isn't paying really any attention there. And the problem is I was once doing this and some idiot like that decided what's underneath the platform. That happens. So anyway, luckily I was there, but a smart instructor also brings, and you can barely see this, there's an assistant instructor or dive master that you bring with them because as an instructor, you know somebody is going to do something stupid. No, you can't stop the person from being stupid, but you can stop the impact of stupid. And that's a really critical factor. And at the end of the day, the dive profession would not exist. Why do we go through all this trouble? Why is there all the training? Because dive organizations have studied for decades how people get themselves killed in diving. And to make it a safe experience, they implement all these certifications, processes, and everything. I know everybody criticizes certifications and things like that, you know, in the cybersecurity community. But in general, certifications do serve a larger purpose. You know, knowing, for example, that when you get to a dive boat, they can trust the certification if it's through an organization that has legitimate things, because this way they know, hey, I don't know how good the guy is, but at least he's able to demonstrate the person is not going to get themselves killed. And usually I say the guy because women are usually not stupid enough to get themselves killed in scuba diving, you know, but that's just what happened. The whole industry exists because they figured out how to stop stupid at the end of the day. Let's see. So where really is the failure? And when people started looking at it in safety science, they started realizing, wait a second, people are getting themselves killed. 90% of the incidents are due to the environment. Only 10% of incidents are due because of some act of the individual, regardless of what's going on around them. So for example, when I did awareness programs for a large company, especially manufacturing, I usually walk around with a safety manager because there's a lot of lessons to be learned from them on how they promote safety and everything else. So that's how we would promote good cybersecurity. And usually when I talk to them, you know, I learned stories. And one guy was telling me as we walked down a factory floor, you know, he's like, you see this yellow line? He's like, we used to have about 5 to 10 accidents a month of people who got hit by a forklift going up and down these aisles because, you know, they would just get hit. So we did a whole bunch of studies. Then we figured out, had a whole bunch of alternatives, one-way rows, two-way, you know, different things. And we figured out the best way was just to paint a line down the center of the aisle and say forklifts stay to one side, people stay to the other side. And that got rid of just about every incident. The only incident they had left was when somebody was on their iPhone and wandered across the lane right into a forklift. Those things happen, but again, the environment is setting people up for success or failure. And you got to realize that. Again, same thing with cybersecurity. Interfaces allow people to make good decisions or bad decisions. If you have a hidden interface, like one thing that bothers me about looking at email messages, for example, on an iPhone or similar device, it's harder to see where the message is from. You can't preview a phishing link without it actually going to the phishing site, which is a bad thing. So anyway, you got to start considering things like that. And again, the environment is part of the problem. But what is the 10%? The 10%, again, could be carelessness. It could be a lack of knowledge, lack of training. There's a difference between a lack of training, lack of knowledge, and outright carelessness. Because even though and there's a concept called the information action fallacy. And what that implies is just because people know something, it doesn't mean they're going to do anything about it. I don't know about you, but people kind of tell me I shouldn't drive above the speed limit. So for some reason, I keep seeing those little signs that are giving me all that information, and I don't take the appropriate action. And frankly, I don't think I'm the only person that doesn't pay attention. But think of, why are people going to pay attention just because you make them sit and watch a video that they hate you for because you're sitting them and making them watch? So anyway, but then there's also malice. Another point to consider, and I started mentioning this before, 3 to 5% of the population are sociopaths or psychopaths by default. It's just that these are people. So a sociopath is a person who really has no empathy, just cares about themselves. A psychopath, not only do they have no empathy, they actually take pleasure in harming others. So that's kind of sort of the difference. There's like more specific, but anyway, these people will do you harm if given the opportunity and they think it's for the betterment or they think it's in their best interest. All they need is the opportunity. And in cybersecurity, we keep telling people, oh, the human firewall, give people awareness. Awareness just helps sociopaths and psychopaths hurt you more. So you got to start considering in your environments, you're not just stopping human mistakes, human lack of knowledge, you're stopping potentially the intentional infliction of harm or theft against your organization. Consider something like accounting. I took out my accounting slides because I had, ran out of time, I usually found. But accounting is another discipline that has been, going on for like 200, 300 years, if not longer. And these people look at, okay, I have to put a system in place that not only stops financial errors, those financial errors might be intentional. So if a CFO ever walked into an organization and walked into a board meeting and said, you know what, we had a $30 million loss, but the loss was due because a person made a mistake and we can't blame the user. Everybody, the CEO would be like, right, we can't blame the user, we blame you. It's your job to put systems in place that expect people to make financial errors, which happens all the time. It's your job to put systems in place that stop financial theft, which happen all the time. Saying a user did it because they made a mistake would never fly in any other type of profession, but we still let those things go unchallenged all the time in cybersecurity. And that's where the problem is. But even when you start looking at human error and where it's really the fault of the user, it's still only 10% of the problem. So using another science and then moving on quickly is counterterrorism. In counterterrorism, there's the concept of boom. And I don't know how many people ever heard the expression moving left in cybersecurity. We got to shift left. We got to shift left. And they use that. I mean, that's essentially military counterterrorism terminology that they've kind of adopted and believe everybody knows exactly what they're talking about, which they really don't. But at the same time, the whole concept of shifting left is really shifting to prevention at the end of the day, which we already do. So say we're shifting left is kind of on the dumb side. But the concept of boom is the explosion or the incident, whatever it happens to be. Left of boom is all the preparations a terrorist might do before the explosion and the point where you can potentially stop the attack from occurring. And then right of boom is the recovery and response to the potential incident. And there's a whole bunch of people that do a whole bunch of things across the spectrum. Now, again, looking there, like if we look at boom, that's like an incident happening, but start at prevention. Prevention, for example, is acknowledging that terrorists or bad people exist and these people are going to potentially do something. And we might go ahead and try to stop them where they exist. We might go ahead and stop their propaganda. We might do whatever it is, try to infiltrate their organization, stop planning, and so on. That's prevention. However, at the same time, people who are responsible with the concept of protection, these are people who focus on the concept that I don't know who's out there to do things, but I'm going to go ahead and try to figure out where the vulnerabilities are they would exploit, and let me try to address those vulnerabilities. So essentially, prevention in counterterrorism works on the threat, while prevention works on the vulnerabilities. And you can stop the vulnerabilities regardless of which threat you're doing. So, this is why when you walk outside federal buildings, you see these big cement blocks. Now, some people would say, okay, well, it's there from people driving up, in explosive vehicles. It's like, yeah, that's happened more than a couple times. So that's why they put that up. That's why they put metal detectors up and everything else like that, because that's prevention regardless of who's doing it. Because somebody could go in because they're, go in, for example, to a court building and shoot people because they're an anarchist. They could go into a court building and shoot people because they're in a divorce hearing and they just want to take everybody with them type of thing. It doesn't matter to the people doing it. They just know, here's how I stop these problems. Then at the point of boom, these, for example, are, the hardened cockpit doors on airlines. They're the blast-resistant cargo bins and so on that would stop or minimize the attack as it's in progress, just as an example. Then moving on to response, recovery, and resilience. And there are differences. With response, for example, you have to understand that terrorists are assholes, let's face it, and that's the kindest word I could think in an audience like this. But generally, as you saw, for example, the latest time there was something like this in Afghanistan, when they were doing Afghanistan, they were doing the evacuation, and what happened was there was a bombing, and then 20 minutes later, there was a second bombing. And you have to train first responders who are responding to incidents like this how to go ahead and be prepared for secondary explosions. You have to train them to, for example, also be prepared for chemical, biological weapons and other sorts of things to go into an area. When I did my scuba diver training, we had to take first aid and stuff like that, and they had us go into a scenario where they set up a room and we had to do and then react to what's going on in the room. And then the first thing that happened was, I'm always the type, I like to watch other people make the mistakes first. So I stood outside and I was credited, besides of being for essentially being lazy, because the instructor said, because they put a mannequin on the floor that was down there. And they basically said, did anybody bother asking why the person's on the floor? Do you know, for example, maybe there's like a gas stove that was leaking? Do you know if there's water on the floor with an electric cord and stuff like that? So a good responder is trained to look before they even engage with the scene, why the scene is going on. And that's the type of issues that you have to be trained for. Are there enough hospitals in the area? Are there enough police and so on? Then there, and then how do people do what they have to do? Then there's recovery. Recovery says all these things are going on. Do we have the capability to get things up and running quickly? If somebody, for example, if there's a bomb, can we go ahead and route people around the area? Can we do a variety of other things? What can we do to go ahead and make sure that everything can keep going and that we can be up and running as quick as possible? Then the concept of resilience says, well, something's going to happen. How can we keep our environment functioning even if there are major incidents, regardless of what the incident is? Keep it up and running. And cybersecurity, how many people heard of Chaos Monkey? Couple people. If you haven't, I didn't do, oh, it's back. How nice. So anyway, Chaos Monkey, for those of you that aren't aware of that, I think that's a concept Netflix invented. And what Netflix does is they have a computer process that randomly takes down components of the network. And it actually takes down components of the network, because what happens is they want to make sure that the network can keep functioning, whatever happens. And they'd rather have a process constantly doing that and then hopefully being able to respond if there's an incident. But anyway, that's the type of stuff you really need to do. And now we need to go ahead and we need to figure out how to adopt this to what we're doing. So I created the term user incident loss. I think I created it. I haven't heard anybody else using it. In my head, I created it. But what happened is, it's the concept that a user really doesn't create damage, much like I started with. A user clicking on a phishing message doesn't encrypt your entire system. A user, however, might initiate a chain of events that results in loss. And your job as, security people working with the user is to stop user-initiated loss. Because again, it just initiates the process, but we got to figure out theoretically how to stop putting the user in a position where they can initiate a loss. And then once the loss is initiated, how can the loss be better mitigated? How can it be mitigated with zero or minimal harm? So that's kind of your goal. But you got to realize, again, using safety science principles, that the user is not specifically causing the harm themselves. Your environment is facilitating and causing the harm. And when you can start looking at it like that, you can start looking at countermeasures that matter and how to stop human error or human malice in that case. So left to boom, one of the jobs is prevent a user from being in the position to create a loss. You can take decision-making capability away from the user. You can, for example, take data away from the user. You can restrict permissions. If you've ever designed systems for a call center analyst or some other people or some other similar people, when somebody calls in, they're given, the call center person is given a bunch of data. The call center person doesn't need all their data. They just need the minimum data that they need to do the job they have to do regarding what that user needs. And so you can take that visibility of data away. And everybody's like, well, I need to empower my users. No, you don't. You want to go ahead and give your users just the capability they need to do their assigned responsibilities. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Then also to that extent, I'll go into this a little bit later, but then to another thing, you can create a culture where that basically people are not going to do things. For example, if you're inside an environment where everybody wears a badge, everybody will wear a badge. If you're in an environment where nobody wears a badge, a newcomer comes in and says, oh, I'm wearing my badge, and they look around saying, I'm the only one wearing my badge, they're going to take the badge off. It's just human nature. I'll tell a story. When I worked at NSA, what happened was my first job that I hated so much, I was an analyst in a 24-hour watch center. And when we were tracking certain type of military units, I can't tell you what units or how, but whenever we got a hit on a unit, I'd have to, put out a report. The report included a map. I'd have to go to a plotter, kind of like now it's a 3D printer type, imagine like an arm moving around and so on. And so I had to take my badge off to use this, map plotter. And what happened was one time I put out the report, ran to the restroom because I had to go really, really bad at 3 a.m. And then as I'm in the hallway, guard comes out, or guard's doing the rounds, and the guard's like, where's your badge? I'm like, I guess it's at my desk. He's like, well, we're going to your desk. I go, you're not allowed anywhere near my desk. He's like, he goes, I'll wait by the door, because he probably gets that a lot. So anyway, he's waiting by the door. I go over to the plotter looking for my badge. I look under the table. I look all over the place. And then after a minute or so, my coworker's like, are you looking for something, Ira? And then he goes, look, remember you said it's okay, but where's my fucking badge? He's like, do you mean the badge that should be around your neck at this point at all times while you're in? I'm like, give me my fucking badge. And then I start yelling at him. And then the guard's like, is there a problem? Do you think I ever forgot that badge again? That is a culture that reinforces good security practices. And a culture, for example, where people put their passwords on monitors, somebody walks by and just tears it off. That's going to be a strong security culture that stops incidents from happening, as an example. But anyway, so another thing, proactively, governance. I don't know about you, but I always hated governance. I hated policies, procedures, standards, and everything like that. Somebody had to sit there and write these documents, and you had to write them well because an auditor would look at them. The problem is that in cybersecurity these days, governance should be more than just a bunch of documents that sit on a shelf until the auditors come in and look at it. Good policies, procedures, guidelines, and everything like that, well, especially procedures and guidelines, should tell people step by step how to do things right. And for example, I use the case, and I don't know where I should actually talk about this, but it's in my head now. But using the example, When somebody gets a phishing message, and these things happen, well, we're at a tax season, even with all the extensions, I think. But normally around tax season, there's W-2 fraud. And what happens is somebody sends an email message into somebody they found on LinkedIn and said, I'm the CEO, I'm traveling, so it's coming from my external account. I need you to send all the W-2 information out to our new accounting firm. Please go ahead and do that immediately because we're behind schedule. And then the user sits there and thinks, okay, now let me go through all my cybersecurity training and think, is this the hacker or is this really the CEO? That's not that's not a decision anybody should be making. What that person should do is say, this is a request for PII. PII related information it is not my ability, it is not my I am not authorized to release PII. These type of requests have to go through the head of HR, and then it gets sent out with the approval of the general counsel's office, etc. The only thing I am authorized to do with an email message like this is to provide it to the head of HR. And that's what they should be thinking. I literally had a case where this is actually a true story, and this wasn't Walmart, so I have to specify that. But before I went to Walmart, I was like CISO of a company and we had a SOC, and one of our customers, it wasn't, they basically sent my SOC a message. We weren't doing their SOC services, but they said, does this look like a phishing message to you? And it was essentially a bomb threat. It literally said, we have placed a bomb inside your facility, and don't you try to find it. I have cameras all over the place. I paid an insider, and send me $5,000 in Bitcoin or the bomb will go off in the morning type of thing. Anyway, they go ahead, it's like, the guy in the SOC said, it doesn't look real if that's what you're asking. It doesn't look like there's really a bomb. And then he texted me, but it was like 1 a.m. I was asleep. Anyway, woke up about 7 a.m, found the text, and then I texted my friend who was the CISO of the organization. I said, sounds like you probably had a busy night. Half hour later, I get a phone call. He's like, why would I have had a busy night? I go, you don't know? He's like, what would I know? I go, you had a bomb threat. He's like, I did. And then I tell him the story. He's like, can you send me the message? I go, I don't have it, but anyway, so then the whole thing, it was ridiculous. Then 12 hours later, they finally called the police after the initial message. It was that bad. Why? Because they took their cybersecurity awareness training and they were determining if this was a phishing message or a real message, as opposed to thinking this is a threat of violence. According to procedure, a threat of violence has to be escalated to these parties. So anyway, boom, at the point of boom, somebody is presented with an opportunity to initiate harm. What do they do with it? Ideally they report it, but whatever they do, the loss can be initiated through accident, carelessness, willful, malicious, or whatever else. Policies and governance. Much like I said, we're creating Elmer Fudd's, and if you don't know who Elmer Fudd is, I really hate you. But Elmer Fudd was always on the lookout for Bugs Bunny, the wascally wabbit. And if Bugs Bunny would put on a dress and a wig, Elmer Fudd could not recognize Bugs Bunny. The 3-year-olds are there. There's Bugs Bunny. It's like Blue's Clues, if you ever hope. I don't know if you know that either. But anyway, it's like a clue. But Elmer Fudd, no matter what, if Bugs Bunny put on a wig and a dress, the users wouldn't understand that. But we're training our users to always be on the lookout for the hacker, as opposed to how do you do things right? And that's where we're failing with the users. Right, boom, a loss has been initiated. Is your environment essentially resilient enough? Or do you have detection and reaction in place to deal with the potential harm that a user has done? And then after the fact also, have you done a post-mortem and said, well, this incident started, how could we have done better throughout the whole process? Anyway, so, to put this all together, everybody likes models. I created a concept called human security engineering and made it look like a model. So anyway, but what happens is governance should embody the whole thing. I'm just going to cover this quickly. If you want, it's in my book, You Can't Stop Stupid, and there's also an article if you don't want to pay for the best book in cybersecurity ever written, on US Cybersecurity Magazine. But anyway, so governance, governance provides the whole framework. Technology infrastructure, essentially, for an attack to get to the user, the whole technology infrastructure has to be supportive of the attack. It has to be in place and doing what's required for the attack to reach the user. Then once the attack gets kind of towards where the user is, there's endpoint technologies. The endpoint technologies could be anti-malware, could be data leak prevention, could be a variety of other things. Then you have the user experience. In other words, what access does the data have? How is data presented to the user, and so on. Then you could have nudges around the user. Nudges are kind of like, those little annoying things on email messages that almost seem worthless most of the time. This is, external message. This is from an outside user, and so on, which would give the user a hint that this might or might not be, or a nudge that this might or might not be a real message. And then you have awareness training. Then you have the user. One of my friends once said it should be kind of like a bow tie, because the attack has to go through all the layers. But then on the way out, it should be going through essentially the same layers. Because when a user takes an action, the action is administered locally, and then it proliferates outside. And your environment should be catching it as it proliferates, because just because there's, I guess you would refer to it as the blast radius. Your job, once a loss has been initiated, is not just stopping it, and if you didn't stop it, you lost. You can essentially be limiting the blast radius to ensure that the level of harm is minimum. And then just to take this to how it really works into phishing, because everybody said, oh, if a user clicks on a phishing message, the user is the most important part of the whole chain. It's like, no, the user is actually one of the smallest parts of the whole chain. Because for phishing messages to exist, and you could do this for any type of thing like USB drops, pretext telephone calls, you can still map all these things out. But just for example, with phishing messages, some bad person has to be able to send messages, phishing messages. Those phishing messages are usually by a botnet, which really is the failure of the whole internet, that some of these botnets exist, because hundreds of thousands, maybe sometimes millions of systems have been compromised, and they could buy the access to the botnet. The phishing messages then go to a perimeter device. And if you're running something like DMARC as an example, you might be able to tell that that isn't a real message coming from a real place. So if you have good perimeter security tools, the message can be stopped. But even if you don't, then it gets to a mail server. The mail server then is supposed to triage, secure email gateway functionality, looks to see if there are malicious files attached, looks to see if there are malicious links, and so on. But anyway, even if that fails, that gets to the email client, where it's finally sitting in an Outlook box, or it's sitting in a web interface or something. And that could either be in the junk mailbox, or that could be inside the user's actual inbox. Now, that itself is starting to create the user experience, because if it's in the junk mailbox, then the user kind of has a clue that that might not be a great message to open up and engage with. Either way, the user experience, the user engages with it. They then might click on it, take the action to say, hey, wait a second, I want to go ahead and click on the link. However, there also should be policies, procedures, and awareness on how to treat these email messages. And they should, again, and I am very specific in that procedures should feed awareness. People should not always be, yes, there is a purpose in motivation and telling bad people exist, but more important, it should tell people how to do their job right. And once you tell people how to do their job right, they take an action. A good user interface that the capability is always there says, wait a second, you want to click on this link. This link doesn't go to where you think it is. It's a really bad idea. Do you really want to click on the link? And then the user says, yeah, I kind of hate my job. I don't care if I get fired for ruining the network. So then what happens is the user then has a bunch of different options. Could be a credential compromise, where the user might go ahead and they want the user ID and password. So that could, that might be stopped through web content filters. Also, data leak prevention might be able to filter out email formats and so on. The other option is they are requesting the user to send out sensitive materials. Now, in the first place, if the user, through the user experience, does not have permission to access the files, they can't send it out. Likewise, if they don't have send privileges, they can't send it out. And either way, data leak prevention should be stopping the messages from going out if they are sensitive. Actually, just to give you an idea, sorry, off topic, but I'll come back to that. Remind me to say come back. Anyway, then there's malware. A link might, for example, whether it's a link or an actual attachment, might be malware. If the user doesn't have permission to download and install any application, then the user can't go ahead and install the malware. It's dead from there. But even if they can, anti-malware should stop it from executing. And then all this leads to how this would be mitigated. Now, just for example, with the sensitive materials, and this is a side story. So, yeah, I can't tell you the name of the company, but one of the larger investment banks. So I know somebody who worked in an investment bank, and they were working in the transaction processing group of like, high private clients. And what happened was they wanted to create like a little mini spreadsheet program, macro, I guess you'd call it. And they wanted to work on that, but they were too busy to work on it at work. So they thought, I'm going to work on it at home, but they needed some data. And what they did was, and this was smart. Well, I'm not going to say smart. The intent was they only needed a few fields, and they knew security was important. So they filtered out all the columns of an Excel table they didn't need, and just had the basic concepts that were involved in the processing, and then sent themselves from their company email to their private email. They sent themselves the file. The next morning, the guy is stopped at the door and says, please come to the security office. And the security office people say, okay, why did you send this data out? And apparently the guy was in tears after an hour. And they realized, well, he did filter out the columns that he didn't need. He showed them the programs and everything checked out. So they did say, okay, we appreciate why you did this. We understand it. We're not going to punish you, but don't do this again. But that was all caught because the DLP was there. And why do they do this? Because sometimes when traders leave an organization like that, they take clients with them. They send all this information. They could be part of a phishing attack where somebody wants the data and they got tricked to sending it out and so on. But this is why those things happen, and this is how they can work. And it doesn't have to fire the user. But anyway, the most important thing from this presentation, stop expecting to put gas masks on canaries. Your users are going to have problems. The situation you're looking for is to make sure you don't have poisonous gas inside your network, using the analogy. And if there is poisonous gas, your network can respond to it. So you need to stop trying this whole fallacy of the human firewall and everything else. And I will leave it at that. Buy my books. They're awesome. Let's see. Security Awareness for Dummies and You Can Stop Stupid. Oh yeah, also Advanced Persistent Security still out. But anyway, Walmart's hiring still, and if you need jobs, let me know. If you have questions, I think I might be out of time, but I'm not sure. Okay, does anyone have a question? Yeah, usually I never get questions anyway, so it's not a big deal. I don't know why, I either dumbfound them or I intimidate them. Or my presentations are just so complete that I don't need them. But anyway, let me know. I'll be around most of the day. Thanks. Oh, you have a question?
No, you said remind you to come back to that.
Oh, no, I came back to the story. The one where like the guy, data leak prevention stopped the file from going out.
So complete.
See?
So complete.
Thanks, everybody.